Assemblyman Bro, any questions?
Yeah, just one question for both of you. Mr. Taylor, on page 3, you talk about the job mix, and it says non-farming jobs. And then also in your presentation, it also says non-farm payroll employment. Why do we exclude farming?
Do you want that? So there are 2 surveys that are done for employment. One is payroll jobs, and that's non-farm payroll jobs. And the reason why that was structured that way, and this is a federal government survey, the reason why it was structured that way is because farms tend to be a mix of family members and some part-time workers, and it's sort of a different kind of animal. There is a category, farm employment, which the federal government puts out based on another survey, the survey that we get our unemployment rates from. Farm employment is actually quite small in California. Farm income is not, but farm employment is, because farming is highly capital intensive. But in some of the counties, so the numbers, the numbers that I showed you on manufacturing, if you were to do that on total employment, including farm, in some counties, you'd find that farm employment much more important and has led to a recovery, but not too many.
Any other questions, member? Assemblyman Chu?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's always nice to hear from you, Mr. Taylor. I just have a quick question for you, Mac. Your presentation 17 and 18, on the 17, from the 2012 to 13, there's about $350 billion flowing into California, but in 15 and 16 dropped down to $100 billion?
No, if I did make that clear, the first chart is all dollars coming into the state, whether it goes directly to individuals or to local governments or directly to military payers. The second one is just the money that goes to the state budget, so it's a subset of that.
Great. So do we know how much money, the total amount that flowed into California from the federal government for the year of 15 and 16?
It would have gone, it was amazing to look back at recent years. It stayed fairly flat, and not surprising since the federal budget situation. But if you looked at 15, 16, I imagine that 350 would have gone up just because of the large increase in federal health care dollars.
You've gone up by just a small amount?
Well, on the 350, maybe another 20 or 30 easily. So it did go up dramatically, the amount of federal dollars in the last 3 years.
Thank you very much. And I do have a comment for Dr. Nicholsberg. On your housing taste, that chart over there, we see an increase of housing permit for denser residential permit. And I think partially because of the taste, but I believe mostly is because of the local government are more encouraging that we're more encouraging for the builder to build multiple unit housings. So it is a train the local government that will encourage them to build up instead of building out. And this is we minimize the best use of the land.
So I do agree with that. I think that there are 3 reasons. One is the jobs are being created in the denser parts of the state. And the second is that people are less inclined, and this is a change in taste, less inclined to drive long distances to have that single-family detached home. So the demand has been pushing up rents and pushing up occupancy rates everywhere that you've had considerable job growth. The third is, exactly as you say, particularly along transportation corridors. So where you have a new subway or light rail or bus lines, cities are much more inclined to approve new multifamily development. And so it really is a combination of the 3. The principal driver, though, is going to be where's the job growth? And the job growth has been in these denser areas.
Any other questions? Member Brown?
I was going to have Mr. Chow speak first because I had kind of a few things to say.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have two questions for Mr. Taylor. On one of your slides on the definition of poverty under the alternative formula, you mentioned that the housing costs is part of the consideration. The other aspect is also non-cash payments. Can you give me some examples of some non-cash payments?
Sure, and again, I don't know exactly which ones might have been included in the old one, but you get a lot of things like, well, healthcare, for example, is a huge one. You could get a housing subsidy, CalFresh or food stamps. Mm-hmm. So it's one thing just to count the money that you might earn from your wage and salary employment, but there are a lot of governmental benefits that are in effect in kind. And so the new measure supposedly does a much better job of capturing your total income, which should be the way that you do it.
Got it. Second question deals with federal dollars. What are some of the ways that we could leverage federal dollars in the area of housing, and particularly affordable housing?
Boy, that's a tough one. Yeah, because you, first of all, don't have a lot of money flowing through the state on housing. The feds do provide, obviously, Section 8 housing subsidies, and I'm not aware of exactly how large that is now, but we don't have a lot of direct programs for us to be able to say, well, if we were willing to increase our investment, they would match that. So I'd have to think about that one assimilating, but there's not big things that pop to mind immediately.
What about the area of tax credits? Is that one area that we could consider?
State tax credits?
State tax credit, yeah, matching sort of.
Well, and again, I'm sorry, I haven't spent a lot of time on the housing credit area for a while, so, but that certainly is the state on its own could try to provide that to induce either more multifamily or growth in certain areas. So that is one way we could do it. Now, we also have the earned income tax credit, which is not housing specific, but is also another way that we can address the in a more targeted way of how to get income to lower income folks.
All right, thank you. Assemblymember Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of observations, and questions as well. You know, we look at the small business loan guarantees. A business may need a loan, and they go to the bank and they say, I need $25,000. And the bank says, I can't help you because it's just as much paperwork for me to give you that loan as it is for me to give you a $100,000 or $200,000 loan. So everyone comes in and talks about the great program of small business, but small business can't seem to access it. And another thing in that caveat in that is that small businesses, when you look at the size of a small business, I had a bill last year that talked about micro businesses. We need to get down below that 5 people in that business because those businesses can even grow more if, in fact, they could get access to that capital. We have a trucking economy in the Inland Empire. And what we find is happening is that with the retrofit of the new trucks and so forth, retrofit of the trucks for CARB, everything is if you have 5 trucks or more. Well, what about that small business that has 1 truck or 2 trucks? They don't get any subsidies, they don't get anything. What can we do to make it more fair for actually the small micro businesses?
So I'll take a stab at that, not knowing any of these programs in detail, but being an economist. California is very much an entrepreneurial state, and when you compare California to other states, it's really in stark contrast. This is a place where people come to start things and build things. And over time, I sense that it has become more difficult to do that. And one of the reasons, and you provide an example of that, is that regulations and programs are not scalable. So you've got this hurdle, which is essentially a tax for starting business. And that's what we economists sometimes call stay-out pricing by those who are already in. And if you made the regulatory environment and the assistance environment scalable rather than have these jump points, then you would create more efficiency and more opportunity. And I think, in basically any economic analysis that you see, those jump points, those hurdles, always create inefficiencies. What you want is sort of smooth transitions.
Thank you. There was one other question. That brought to mind. You said you can increase the payment. You can increase IHSS. You could increase the hours. We could increase the hours. We could increase what? The number of people. Because
Sure.
we're going to have a silver tsunami, and people are going to have some resources, and have to have some. Have to have a way to be taken care of. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. IHSS is in-home supportive services that we provide to low-income people who are at risk of being institutionalized because they can't take care of themselves daily functions in their own home. And it is a good example, Assemblyman Brown, that on the natural, we have defined the program of who's eligible. And you're right. On the natural, caseloads will go up. We don't have to do anything. We'll provide our extra funds. It will cost us general fund, but the federal government will match those. We'll automatically get more federal funds coming in. It's just that obviously there's that cost because the program are shared. Now, we could make policy decisions that we wanted to, say, increase the number of hours that someone could have. And that also would then involve cost on our part, and presumably if it was within the federal regulations and not outside what they would fund, they would also match those costs. We could increase, as we have done in the past, the payments that we provide to providers. And again, that cost us or the county's money to do that, our share, but the federal government would match those. So you have on the natural caseload will increase both of government's level of cost, but you then have policy choices that you will make, and there's a cost to be paid for them, but the federal government will provide their share of it. So it's just lowers the cost for you to make those policy improvements, and it does bring in additional funds to the state.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblymember Brown. Vice Chair?
Actually, I just wanted to thank the distinguished panels and giving us a very nice overview of where we stand in California. And our first speaker, Ms. Davis, gave us the overview of where we are from the federal perspective. So I think what I'm interested in is really providing more time for the rest of our panelists and the speakers that we have invited, based on the tone and the stage that you set for us, where we are currently. And I would like to find out more from them. So thank you very much for allowing our distinguished speakers to give us an overview. Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you again.
Yeah.
We'll move on to item 4, impact of federal policy and programs in California's economic growth. Our speaker is Molly Ramsdell. She is the director for the National Conference of State Legislators in Washington. Ms. Ramsdell has served as a staff liaison for a number of standing committees, including Transportation, Budgets and Revenues, Environment, and the Executive Committee Task Force on Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. I guess we'll just jump right in. Ms. Molly Ramsdell, thank you for being here, and if you're ready to present.
Yes, thank you. I
please
think
feel
they're
free.
just going to pull up the PowerPoint here. And then do I move it along with this? Just this one right here moves on? Great. Chairman Garcia, Vice Chair Kim, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's always nice to leave cold, chilly D.C. and come to sunny, warm California. Again, I'm Molly Ramsdell from NCSL. And for those of you unfamiliar with NCSL, it's the bipartisan organization that serves the legislatures of our nation, and that's legislators as well as legislative staff. So you are all members, your staff are members. And I also would like to let you know that I've recently been appointed as one of California's liaisons to NCSL. So I'll make sure that I leave my cards behind. So if there's anything you need or you want to know how to navigate NCSL or who to call, you can just call me and I'll help get you to the right people. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit more about the federal budget. You've already talked about some of the issues or some of the things in the federal budget. I'm going to talk more about process and programs, just so you kind of understand not just the flow of money to the states, but how the process of the federal budget affects states and the flow of funding. We're going to talk a little bit more about federal outlays, the grants to states. You've already heard a little bit about that. We're going to talk about some upcoming deadlines in Congress and in Washington, D.C., and some other items that may be of interest to this committee to watch. Originally, I had put together a slide because I thought it's important to kind of walk you through the statutory deadlines as it relates to the federal budgeting process. But then I decided to take it out because for the most part, the process and the deadlines are not met by Congress. And this is really important to know because when these deadlines aren't met, it means funds may not arrive in the state when they're expected to arrive, and there's a lack of certainty when it comes to state planning because it makes long-term planning, especially in certain areas like transportation and infrastructure, obviously something of importance to not only California but the entire nation, really critical and challenging to plan for when you don't know if you're going to continue to get the appropriate level of funding. So where are we now? As you know, earlier this month, the president released his budget. Big dollar picture, it's a little over $4 trillion. If you broke that out, it's about $2.6 billion in mandatory spending and $1.2 in discretionary spending, and then the remaining goes to interest on our national debt. As for some highlights of the president's budget, just to review them, a lot of them you've probably already heard about. It ends the spending caps that were on discretionary spending and some mandatory spending. What do I mean by that? Remember back in 2011, there was a report released in a commission that we were about controlling the federal deficit, and the Budget Control Act was enacted, and within that there was a deal struck to control our deficits by doing something called sequester that did across-the-board cuts and established spending caps in the future. Well, the president's budget eliminates this. Both sides, I would think, Republicans and Democrats in Congress, are generally, none of them were really happy with the idea that this was going to move forward. The challenge here is it may be a good idea, but how do you get there? And it's do you cut spending, do you increase taxes or increase revenue, or is it some kind of mix? And can Congress, this new Congress, come to some agreement on how you actually get to that? Some highlights from the president's budget that may be of interest to this committee. Obviously, there's increased spending for infrastructure and transportation in particular. There's a national infrastructure bank. You talked a little bit earlier about community colleges. As you may have heard, the president has a proposal to make 2 years of community college free. The feds would pay for 3/4 of it. The state would have to pay for the other quarter. There's money for states to reimburse workers for taking leave for specific family or medical reasons. I know California already has kind of a family medical leave program. It reverses cuts for Head Start, looks at universal pre-K. It would actually pay for that with an increase in the cigarette tax. It continues a lot of middle-class tax cuts. And it also calls for comprehensive immigration reform, which I'll talk a little bit about later. A couple other things that may be of interest. It expands an initiative that's recently new called the Expanding Promise Zone Initiative, and I believe LA currently has one of those, and it expands that, and we'll create a couple more of those. The president's budget also proposes something called the Upward Mobility Project. And this kind of goes to the Assembly members' question about affordable housing and money there. One of the things the president is proposing is to allow states to consolidate 4 specific block grants, and they include the Social Services Block Grant, the Community Service Block Grant, Home Improvement Partnership, and another one. And there's a lot of goals of the program, and there'd be flexibility to kind of break down the silos. But one of the things is to have affordable housing goals as part of that. But again, this is just something in the president's proposal. Is the president's budget a starting point for Congress, like maybe a governor's budget would be? Let me put it this way. The final spending package will look a lot different. It will not look like the president's budget. This is not uncommon. The president's budget does set a tone, or I could say in some cases a battle for discussions. It sets out, things on spending reductions, changes in entitlement programs, and obviously the need to address the nation's debt and the annual deficit always becomes a challenge in this process. Just to finish the whole process, kind of, what's next in the perfect world. In the budget process, there would be something called a budget resolution that would be passed. And this is not the force of law. The president does not sign this. It's just something that includes various budget allocations for the different levels of spending. Then the appropriations committees would begin their work. And the idea is that by October 1, we would have all of the appropriations bills through the process. It's too soon to tell whether this process will be met. I would say history, if you look at history, it's probably unlikely. I asked one of my staff to go back and look at when the last time actually Congress finished all their appropriations bills by the start of the fiscal year, and they said what they saw was back in 1997. So the fact is, that deadline will most likely not be met, and what Congress will most likely do is some kind of continuous resolution to continue the funding. One thing I need you all to remember, too, is that we technically are not done with the 2015 spending from the federal government. As you may know, last year they passed what was called a cromnibus, which was an omnibus in addition to a continuing resolution, a great name that they came up with. It basically funded all programs to the end of the fiscal year except for the Department of Homeland Security. Their funding will expire at the end of February. The reason for this is that they wanted to come back in the new Congress and address concerns raised with the president's executive order on immigration. The House has passed legislation that contains some riders that address the concerns and strips out a lot of the ability of the president to implement his executive order. What the Senate has been unable to move the House legislation at this point. Time will tell what happens. The fact is that the Homeland Security funding expires at the end of this month, and there is the talk that they may just have to do a short-term continuation until they can come to some agreement. I think this will need to be resolved first, but it is kind of a test and kind of sets the groundwork for how, potentially future appropriations bills and negotiations on federal spending may happen. So what does all of this mean for states? This is just a pie chart that shows the general composition of federal outlays. And again, this is using, as in previous presentations, FY 2013 figures. And it shows you kind of the Social Security, Medicare, defense, and that one sliver there that's in red, domestic discretionary, the 17%. This is pretty much the grants that come to state and local governments. If you look over the years, generally that percentage is kind of shrinking as it gets squeezed out by other areas. In your briefing materials, you have a handout that looks at major discretionary and mandatory grants to states. It gives you the actual dollar figures for 2013. I think you've got 14, 15, and what the state would receive under the president's budget. It shows you the California numbers. You should have the California numbers as well as the national numbers. As you heard earlier, how does California fare? Many of these grants are driven by population. So in pure dollars, it's not a surprise that California receives, in most cases, the largest dollar amount of these funds. And I apologize, there's a zero missing there. If you look at this at per capita federal spending, those same programs, you've got a high in the District of Columbia and Alaska, a low in New Hampshire and Nevada, and California falls in there, and sorry, that should be a 2,000. That's kind of the per capita federal spending on selected grants. But again, as we discussed earlier, this does not include all the funds that are coming in to the state. You should have another handout, which would not have been well on a slide, that shows some bar graphs across it. And I'll give you a minute to find that. This includes all grants and contracts flowing into each state, including to nonprofit and individuals as well as to state and local governments. It also takes into account retirement and non-retirement benefits and contracts. I did go in and look at the raw data behind this, and I'm happy to provide it to you if you're interested in the raw data behind this. Again, California receives, did everybody find it? Yeah. Okay. California receives the highest dollar amount except for one category, and you could probably, in one state. And does anybody want to take it? It's kind of hard to see it. The only area where another state, dollar-wise, Virginia actually had, again, this is 2013 data, received more contract funding from the federal government than California. And I'm going to go back and see if we can get some details. I was thinking it could be just the proximity to Washington, D.C. and contract. I mean, I would think it could be defense contract, but I'm not sure. It could be that there's so many contract employees, but I think that would fall into salaries. So I'm going to go back and see if I can get some information. And Mr. Chair and Madam Vice Chair, I've spoken to staff. We're going to try and get you some further breakdown on the grant funds to see if we can get you more information on the grants that aren't flowing through the state, that are just generally coming into the state, but not necessarily through the appropriations process. So see if you can have some more information on that. So now you have a big picture of the federal funds that go to California, and you probably have more detail. Again, if you need more information on any of these, I'd be happy to provide it. But I'd also like just to take a couple minutes to talk about, while I say nothing in Congress, necessarily the deadlines and delays can cause problems, I'd like to talk about some other upcoming deadlines that you want to be aware of. First, I mentioned the February 27th, the funding for the Department of Homeland Security expiring. On March 15th, we could also potentially hit the debt limit again, which, as you know, could be a very long debate in Congress as well on whether to raise that and how to raise that. May 31st, a very, very big one. We have the authorization of the surface transportation programs expiring and the potential insolvency of the Highway Trust Fund. I want to spend a moment on this one. The Highway Trust Fund brings in about $35 billion a year, and this is mostly through the gas tax, which is the federal gas tax is 18.4 cents per gallon. Hasn't been increased since 1993. We spend or need about $50 billion to fund the Highway Trust Fund. What's happening now is about 30% is currently being supported by general fund transfers. This is, I think, of all the issues, this is on the front burner for all members of Congress. They all agree on the program. It's how you're going to fund it. There have been proposals about increasing the gas tax. They're looking at pilots, but the problem is there's a short-term problem in the fund going insolvent, and then there's the long-term problem of, yes, we can put a one-time infusion in there to get us over the hump, but how do we actually fund the repair and maintenance of our roads and bridges in the long term given the gas tax is not going to support long term. And if you want to do kind of a user-based fee, what are the options out there? The president has proposed a one-time tax on companies that incorporate abroad to avoid higher taxes in the U.S. This, again, though, would only be kind of a one-time increase in funding that would kind of get us through the next authorization. We've got the Export-Import Bank authorization that expires. The federal aviation authorization, which includes airport improvement grants, again, something to watch, and also the funding for the Children's Health Insurance Program. It's one of those things that Congress didn't address in the last session. That also is due to expire. So again, there are some really critical dates here that are coming up that will affect states when it comes to what funds and programs. Also on October 1, yes, the next federal fiscal year begins. As for other items to watch, I call this kind of my R&R, reform and reauthorizations. The first one being immigration. I think it's really too soon, again, to tell whether comprehensive immigration reform will move forward. There's actually a hearing today in Washington, D.C., which is one of the first. Again, we've got the efforts to block the president's executive order. I know one of the things this committee was looking at is concerned about is the EB-5 visa program. It is up for renewal this year. According to sources, there is concern Chairman Grassley from Iowa is not expected to be as favorable as former Chairman Leahy was from Vermont. That's because Vermont had an EB-5 regional center owned, controlled, and supervised by state government. So only time will tell, but there, if it's something you were interested in, there is concern whether he, again, will be as friendly to that program. We have several other people on our staff who are following that closely, and I could put you in touch or make sure they keep you up to date on the activities. Nothing has been introduced or been discussed so far to date. Tax reform, you heard about that earlier. Regulatory reform. This is one thing I want to bring up only because what I expect we will see in this Congress is the attempt by members of Congress to attach riders to lots of pieces of legislation to block regulatory activities by the administration, whether it has to do with greenhouse gas emissions, whether it has to do with water. There will be, again, or the immigration. I mean, there will be lots of efforts to block, either by blocking funding or some other mechanism. On the reauthorization, K through 12, actually, there are hearings this week, and that actually appears to be moving forward. Higher ed, I'm not sure why this kind of in the screen here got a little backwards. Higher ed reauthorization, again, I mentioned the Export-Import Bank and the Surface Transportation reauthorization, and I think there was one more on there that we can't see. No, that's it. And the FFA reauthorization. Other items besides those that I would recommend that the committee keep an eye on, obviously implementation and the regulations that are going to be released regarding the Workforce Innovations and Opportunity Act. As you know, the implementing regulations have been delayed. There will be a series of 5 notices of proposed rulemaking released later this spring. There's going to be some guidance to states that's supposed to come out soon to kind of get us through this 1 year of activity before the final regs are issued, not until next year. Obviously, there are trade agreements out there pending, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. I talked to our staff that follow this. There is some thought that maybe the earlier one, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, could be ratified this year, but again, there hasn't been anything introduced. There's nothing going on it yet, so again, time will have to tell. Another thing that NCSL has been working very hard on is something called the Marketplace Fairness Act, or the e-fairness legislation that allows states to require sales and use tax collection by out-of-state retailers if they adopt specific tax simplification. This kind of goes to, while you were talking about small businesses, it's really something kind of leveling the playing field for kind of your brick and mortar stores that are here. And I think that's probably, I'm going to stop there. If I can't answer any of your questions, we have lots of staff who are more expert on some of these issues than I am. But again, I look forward to your questions. And again, at any time in the future, if you need any assistance, please don't hesitate to call on me as your liaison.
Thank you.
Thank you.